Chapter 5, page 122. Note several examples of ecosystem services on this picture. Remember that an ecosystem service is something that nature gives to humans for survival or economic value, not something that nature gives itself. Know all the vocab on this page, from sink to flux to reservoir. And you can see up here, there's a diagram showing you what source and sink are and what flux is, so make sure you know all of those. The first cycle to talk about is the water cycle. And make sure on the next page, page 124, that you know all the vocab for the water cycle. That should be review. This is something that you've learned in the past that you really should know, like what precipitation is, and aquifer, and groundwater, and water table. So make sure you know those things. The AP test also likes to talk about human impacts. So know that for all the cycles. So know that in the water cycle, the human impacts are building dams and aqueducts, irrigation, and overpumping groundwater. For the carbon cycle, the largest reservoir is sedimentary rock. The second is oceans. And yes, the AP test expects you to know the reservoirs. Also know that oceans take in carbon through these ways. Oceans taking in carbon is kind of a big deal lately because of something called ocean acidification that we will study later on. But basically, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolves into the water, and that dissolved carbon dioxide can fit into the shells or be taken in the shells of certain animals like corals, and they build calcium carbonate shells. And then also through photosynthesis. So here's a simpler version of the carbon cycle here, and I would take a minute to pause the video to write it down because while it looks complicated, it is simpler than the one in your book. All right, going on to the way that humans alter the carbon cycle. We mine and we burn fossil fuels. We cut down forests. We burn those forests and other biomass. We add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which causes global warmings. So again, FRQs in the past have asked students to write about ways that humans alter whatever cycle they ask you about. It could be carbon, it could be nitrogen, it could be phosphorus, it could be the water cycle. Sometimes it is. Okay, go on a couple pages over to 129, and here we have the nitrogen cycle. So this one, again, is a little more simple. Even though it looks complex, it's a little more simple. So we have nitrogen gas, which is not a usable form. There's a ton of nitrogen gas in the atmosphere, but plants really can't use it. It has to be turned into a usable form. So that's done through nitrogen fixation. On the roots of certain plants, we have legumes. On the roots of legumes, we have nitrogen-fixing bacteria and nodules, which create nitrogen in the form of NH4, which is ammonia. And fixation can also occur through lightning strikes. And then other plants can use that nitrogen in the form of ammonia and also in the form of nitrates, NO3. How we get nitrogen in our bodies, because we need nitrogen in our bodies. DNA is made out of nitrogen, parts of it, and so it's essential to our body. So we get it through eating things with nitrogen, like plants and animals, and that's called assimilation. Also, the plants absorbing nitrogen through the roots is also assimilation. Okay, so then we have waste, poop, waste, and also things when they die. Waste and dead things contains ammonia, and so basically the decomposition process is called ammonification. It turns waste into ammonia. Ammonia, though, is very toxic, especially in aquatic ecosystems. And so it needs to be turned into something less toxic. So we have nitrifying bacteria that turn ammonia into nitrites first and then nitrates. And that process is called nitrification. And bacteria does all of this. And then different bacteria can turn nitrate back into nitrogen gas through the process called denitrification. Yes, you need to know all of this and what happens at every stage. It's complicated. You just have to sit down and memorize and learn it. It's very important. The AP test loves the nitrogen cycle, and it will be part of a lot of other chapters coming up. So take the time to learn it. So nitrogen fixation, nitrogen gas to ammonia, it happens through lightning strikes or mostly through nitrogen fixing bacteria on the roots of legumes. Nitrification, again, is nitrifying bacteria convert ammonia into nitrites first and then into nitrates. Plants really prefer nitrates. It's a more usable form for plants. And then denitrification takes nitrates back into nitrogen gas. Going on, okay, so we have the process of ammonification and assimilation. So these are our next two processes in the nitrogen cycle. Ammonification, let me just go ahead and slide this here, is again decomposition in animal waste, have ammonia, which is toxic to aquatic life. And then we have assimilation, which is in taking in nitrates through the roots of plants and eating food for us as animals is assimilation. So how do humans alter the nitrogen cycle? Well, we can actually make synthetic nitrogen through what's called the Haber-Bosch process. So these are two German scientists who figured out how to take nitrogen in the atmosphere and turn it into synthetic nitrogen like ammonia or nitrates. And so now fertilizers contain artificial nitrates. We also burn fossil fuels, and that releases NO2, which is an air pollutant. We also plant a lot of legumes. We plant a lot of soy in this country because soy is actually a filler. If you buy processed packaged foods, it has soy in it. So you might not think you're eating a lot of soy, but you probably are. And then acid rain contains, some acid rain is nitric acid. And we'll study that later on in chapter 17. Going on to the next cycle, we have the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus cycle, here's a simpler drawing. So it's a slow cycle, and basically you have producers give us phosphorus for our bodies when we eat plants. We need phosphorus because DNA has a sugar phosphorus backbone, and ATP in our body is made out of adenosine triphosphate, so we need phosphates. Okay, animal waste or dead organisms give phosphates back to producers. All right, also in ecosystem, another way we get phosphorus in ecosystems is through the weathering of rocks, and also through the mining of guano, which is seagull manure, seagull poop, and also animal manure, and also rocks with mining. So it's a little bit different because whenever you buy fertilizer at the store, the nitrogen is synthetic, man-made through Haber-Bosch. But phosphorus is not, because phosphorus we cannot make in the lab. We have to get it either from guano in caves, or from animal manure, or from mining of rocks. That's really how we get phosphorus. We cannot make it in a lab. So phosphorus, the largest reservoir, that's a typo, it should say reservoir, is rocks and sediments, and then weathering of rock releases it into the ecosystem, and that makes it a limiting factor because weathering of rocks is very slow, and so ecosystems have a very slow input of phosphorus into it, and so that's why it's often a limiting factor. Plants on land tend to run out of phosphorus pretty easily. It cannot be synthetically made, and it has to be mined from rocks or harvested from guano, which is seagull poop, or bat cave poop is where they get phosphorus for fertilizer. How do we alter the phosphorus cycle? Oh, sorry.
We use detergents like to wash our cars or in our dishwashers, which has phosphorus. Sometimes that can run into streams and rivers. Untreated sewage is very high in phosphorus, and it's also in crops as a fertilizer. Fortunately, in the United States, we have the Clean Water Act, which prevents sewage from being dumped into rivers and streams or the ocean before being treated. And our wastewater treatment plants take out phosphorus and nitrates. But other countries don't have the same laws, or they're not enforced, and so you have a human sewage that's dumped.
All right, also on this page, note several ways to prevent eutrophication.
Just so you know, the first one is not great. There have been FRQs
In the past on the AP test that asks students to come up with solutions for eutrophication. And the first one was not accepted because it's too vague. So if you want to say reduce nitrogen fertilizer on Midwestern farms, you have to say, how do you do this? How do you reduce fertilizer use? Alternate crops, different kinds of timing for your crops, artificial wetlands, etc. So make sure you know, let's say 2 of them, and again the first one's too vague, so the other ones are better, to prevent eutrophication if you have that on an FRQ. And that's it. That's the end of chapter 5.